The black belt asked a black janitor to spar with him for fun. What happened next silenced the entire martial arts gym. "Hey, you there cleaning. How about a quick demonstration?" shouted Derek Mitchell from the center of the mat, his black belt gleaming under the gym's fluorescent lights. "I bet you've never seen a real fight in your life, right?" James Washington stopped mopping the floor and slowly looked up. At 42, he had been working as a janitor at that gym for only 3 weeks, always arriving after hours when the students had already left. But on that Thursday night, the advanced classes training had gone past the usual time. "I don't want to bother you, Sensei," James replied calmly, returning to scrubbing a stubborn stain on the floor. "Just finishing up here so you can get back to it." Derek let out a loud theatrical laugh that echoed through the gym. "Everyone, look at this. The guy's afraid to even step on the mat." The 8 students present laughed nervously, some clearly uncomfortable with the situation. What Derek didn't know was that James had spent the last 20 years trying to completely forget who he really was. 20 years since he left the ring after an accident that changed his life forever. 20 years keeping a secret that not even his teenage daughter knew about. "Come on, man," Derek continued, approaching him with that arrogant smile he used to intimidate beginners. "Just a little demonstration. I bet you don't even know how to do a basic guard. How about showing my students the difference between someone who trains and someone who just cleans?" James felt that familiar sensation in his chest, like a dormant muscle being awakened after years of inactivity. His eyes met Derek's briefly, and for a split second, something passed between them that made the instructor take an involuntary step back. "Just an educational demonstration," Derek insisted, now trying to hide the sudden uncertainty in his voice. "Nothing too serious. Just to show the beginners why it's important to respect the martial art." James set the bucket on the floor and stood up slowly. His movements had a fluidity that was strange for someone who had supposedly never stepped on a tatami mat before. Around the gym, the students stopped training, realizing that something was happening. "All right," James said finally, his voice calm like the surface of a lake before a storm. "But when we're done, you're going to apologize to all of them for turning the mat into a circus." Derek laughed, but this time the sound was a little forced. "Apologize? Man, you're going to be the one apologizing to the floor when you meet it." What none of those people knew was that James Washington had once been James Silent Storm Washington, 5-time world mixed martial arts champion. He had retired at the height of his career after an accident that cost the life of his best friend and training partner. Since then, he had sworn never to fight again. But some promises are made to be broken when dignity is at stake. If you're enjoying this story of overcoming adversity and justice, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to find out how a simple moment of prejudice would turn into the most humiliating lesson of Derek Mitchell's life. Derek adjusted his black belt with a theatrical gesture, clearly savoring every second of attention. "Everyone, gather around. You're about to see a practical demonstration of why there is a hierarchy in the world of martial arts." James watched as the 8 students formed a semicircle around the mat. Some seemed eager for the demonstration, others visibly uncomfortable. A young Asian woman with her hair tied back muttered something to her classmate next to her, who just shook his head in disapproval. "Look everyone," Derek continued, gesturing dramatically. "Here we have a perfect example of someone who never understood that there are appropriate places for certain types of people. Elite gyms are not for, well, you know." James felt that familiar twinge in his chest, the same one he had felt 20 years ago when he heard similar comments about fighters who didn't look like champions. The difference was that now, at 42, he had learned to turn anger into fuel for something much more powerful than punches. "Sensei Derek," the young Asian woman interrupted timidly, "maybe we can continue our normal training? It's getting late and—" "Sarah-chun, are you questioning my teaching methodology?" Derek cut her off sharply. "Sit down and watch. You'll learn more in the next 5 minutes than in a month of conventional training." James noticed how Derek used the girl's full name, a clear demonstration of authority. He also recognized the look of fear in her eyes, the same look he had seen in the mirror 2 decades ago when he woke up in a panic remembering the accident that took the life of Tony Hammer Rodriguez, his best friend and training partner. Tony had died because of him. It was that simple. A series of punches that James had thrown with excessive force during sparring. Tony fell, hit his head on the floor in a strange way, and never woke up. The investigation concluded that it was an accident, but James knew the truth. He had lost control because of the pressure and the racist comments from the audience that night. "So janitor," Derek sneered, "how about showing my students how to do a basic guard? Or is that too complicated for someone who only knows how to push a mop?" Laughter echoed around the gym, but James remained motionless. His eyes closed briefly, and for a moment he was back in that ring in Las Vegas, hearing the same kinds of comments that preceded the tragedy that changed his life forever. "What's the matter? Are you scared?" Derek insisted, now circling James like a predator. "Or are you just going to stand there like a lamppost, like you do with the squeegee all day?" That was when Derek made his first fatal mistake. He pushed James lightly on the shoulder, a seemingly harmless touch, but one that carried all the arrogance of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. James absorbed the push without moving an inch. His feet remained planted on the ground like oak roots, and Derek felt as if he had tried to push a concrete wall. The instructor's arrogant smile faltered for a split second. "Interesting," James muttered, more to himself than to Derek. "It's been a while since someone tried to provoke me like that." There was something in James' voice that changed the atmosphere. It wasn't threat or anger, it was the frightening calm of someone who had walked through much darker valleys and emerged transformed. Derek, unable to interpret the danger signals, doubled down. "Did you hear that, guys? He thinks it's interesting. How about we show him the difference between thinking and knowing?" What Derek didn't realize was that every humiliating word and gesture was awakening something in James that had been dormant for 2 decades. Not anger or a thirst for revenge, but something far more dangerous, the crystal-clear memory of who he really was when he stopped hiding. Sarah Chun watched the scene with growing discomfort. There was something about the way the janitor breathed, the way his muscles tensed almost imperceptibly, that reminded her of the documentaries about large predators she watched on the Discovery Channel. The calm before the attack. "Last chance, buddy," Derek announced, now clearly irritated by James' lack of response. "Either you accept the demonstration like a man, or I call security to escort you out. And guess what? You lose your job too." James opened his eyes slowly. When his gaze met Derek's, the instructor felt a chill run down his spine, as if he had just awakened a dragon he thought was a harmless lizard. "All right," James said finally, his voice low but laden with an authority that made everyone present fall silent instantly. "But when we're done, I want you to explain to your students why you turned a place of learning into a circus of humiliation." Derek laughed, but this time the sound was nervous. "Explain? Man, you're going to have a lot of explaining to do when you're on the floor." What neither of them knew was that James had spent the last 20 years not only running from his past, but perfecting an emotional control that had transformed his former destructive rage into something much more refined and devastatingly effective. Each new humiliation only fueled a silent strength within him, a cold determination that his former opponents knew well, but that Derek was about to discover in the worst possible way. Derek adjusted his posture, clearly pleased with the respectful silence that had fallen over the gym. His 8 students formed a perfect circle around the mat, some eager for the demonstration, others visibly uncomfortable with the situation unfolding before them. "Everyone, you are about to witness a lesson worth more than 6 months of training," Derek announced theatrically, extending his arms like a showman. "The difference between those who dedicate their lives to martial arts and those who just, well, clean the floor where real fighters walk." James stood motionless in the center of the mat, but something had changed in his breathing. His eyes closed briefly, and for a moment he was no longer in that gym in Denver. He was back at the National Gymnasium in Las Vegas 22 years ago, hearing identical comments from the audience before his world title fight against Victor the Demolition Man Petrov. "Look at that little black guy," someone in the stands had shouted that distant night. "I bet he won't last 3 rounds against a real fighter." James had won by technical knockout in the 2nd round, but the victory had cost him dearly. The pressure of the racist comments had caused him to lose control during the following sparring session, resulting in the accidental death of Tony Rodriguez. "So janitor," Derek sneered, now circling James like a predator, "how about showing my students how not to do a basic guard? Or is that too complicated for someone who only knows how to push a mop?" That's when Sarah Chun couldn't stay silent any longer. The 22-year-old purple belt in jiu-jitsu and master student in sports psychology had spent the last 2 years documenting cases of discrimination in sports for her thesis. What she was witnessing was valuable academic material, but also deeply disturbing. "Sensei Derek," she interrupted firmly, "can I ask you a question? Why exactly do you think it's necessary to humiliate someone who is just doing his job? The silence that followed was deafening. Derek slowly turned to Sarah, his eyes narrowing with a mixture of surprise and irritation. "Excuse me, Sarah, but who's teaching the class here?" "You are," she replied calmly, "but that shouldn't include racial humiliation disguised as a technical demonstration." Several students exchanged nervous glances. No one had ever confronted Derek like this before. The instructor felt his face flush with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. "Racial." Derek laughed forcedly. "This has nothing to do with race. It has to do with respect for the martial art and knowing your place." James opened his eyes slowly. There was something in the way Sarah had spoken, in the courage of a young woman standing up to established authority, that reminded him of his younger sister, Keisha. She had had that same determination, that same refusal to accept injustice silently. Keisha had died at 17, the victim of a stray bullet during a police confrontation in her neighborhood. James was competing in Japan when he received the news. Another person he loved, lost while he pursued glory in distant rings. Another reason to abandon everything and disappear into the simplicity of an anonymous life. "Sarah," Derek said in a dangerously low voice, "if you can't respect my teaching methods, maybe you should look for another gym. There are places more suited to people with your mentality." The threat hung in the air like toxic smoke. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine, but she stood her ground. "My tuition is paid, Sensei. And I believe that everyone here deserves a learning environment based on mutual respect, not humiliation." That's when James did something no one expected. He started to smile. It wasn't a nervous or submissive smile. It was the slow, calculated smile of someone who had just found a reason to stop hiding. For 20 years, he had carried the weight of guilt for 2 deaths that had indirectly resulted from his involvement in the fighting world. Now, seeing a brave young woman defending principles of justice that he had abandoned decades ago, James Washington began to remember who he really was. "Derek," James said finally, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made everyone in the room turn to him. "The young lady is right. This isn't about martial arts. It's about you trying to feel important by belittling others." Derek spun on his heels, his face red with indignation. "How dare you lecture me about martial arts? You don't even know what a dojo is." James took a step forward, and something fundamental changed in his posture. His shoulders straightened, his center of gravity lowered imperceptibly, and his feet positioned themselves in a stance that any experienced fighter would instantly recognize as perfect. "Actually," James said calmly, "I know exactly what a dojo is. And I know that this place stopped being one a long time ago." Derek felt an inexplicable chill run down his spine. There was something about the way James moved now, the way he occupied the space, that awakened all of his instincts for self-preservation. But his wounded pride would not allow him to back down. "Enough talk," Derek growled, assuming his favorite fighting stance. "I'll teach you respect the hard way." Sarah watched the scene with growing apprehension, but also with professional fascination. She had documented hundreds of hours of sparring and competitions for her research, and something about the way the janitor moved reminded her of the great masters she had studied in historical videos. The economy of movement, the controlled breathing, the calm presence that radiated contained power. James closed his eyes briefly and allowed 22 years of muscle memory to resurface. Every technique perfected, every victory won, every lesson learned in the most brutal rings in the world. When he opened them again, Derek was looking directly into the eyes of Silent Storm Washington, 5-time world mixed martial arts champion. "Last chance to apologize," James offered kindly. To her students, and to turn this place back into a learning space. Derek laughed, but the sound came out nervous and forced. "Apologize? Man, you'll be begging for forgiveness when you're on the floor." What Derek couldn't see was that James had already identified all of his technical weaknesses. The high guard that left his body exposed, the tendency to retreat with his right leg first, the way he telegraphed his punches with micro-movements of his shoulder. 22 years away from the ring had not erased decades of refined technical analysis. Sarah noticed that other students were instinctively backing away, like wild animals sensing an impending storm. Something in the energy of the room had completely changed, as if the air had become electrically charged before a lightning strike. It was when everyone laughed at Derek's latest taunts that something unexpected began to take shape in James' expression. Not anger or a desire for revenge, but the calm determination of someone who had found a cause worth breaking a 20-year vow of silence for. Some of those present began to realize that something extraordinary was about to happen, even without fully understanding. Derek assumed his favorite fighting stance, the one he had used to intimidate hundreds of beginners over the years. Feet shoulder-width apart, fists clenched at chest level, weight slightly forward. The classic stance of someone who had learned martial arts in controlled environments against predictable opponents. James stood motionless for a few seconds, simply observing. His eyes scanned Derek from head to toe, automatically cataloging every technical detail. The high guard that left his ribs exposed, the unstable base that compromised his balance, the excessive tension in his shoulders that telegraphed every move before it even began. Still waiting. Derek sneered, hopping slightly on his feet. Or are you just going to stand there like a lamppost? That's when James did something no one expected. He started to move. It wasn't a dramatic change, just a subtle repositioning of his feet, a slight lowering of his center of gravity, his shoulders relaxing into a perfectly horizontal line. But to anyone who knew what to look for, the transformation was instantaneous and frightening. Sarah Chen felt a chill run down her spine. During 2 years studying sports biomechanics, she had analyzed hundreds of hours of footage of great fighters. What she had just witnessed was the transition from an ordinary man to a born predator, a change as subtle as it was devastating. Interesting, Derek muttered, his confidence wavering for the first time. There was something about the way James occupied the space now that awakened all of his self-preservation instincts. James took a step forward, and Derek instinctively backed away. The movement was so involuntary, so primitive, that several students noticed. A black belt backing away from a janitor? The power dynamic in the room had completely shifted. Problem? James asked softly, his voice carrying a quiet authority that silenced everyone. Derek felt the blood rush to his cheeks. His reputation was being questioned in front of his own students. He couldn't back down now, even though every fiber of his being was screaming at him to stop and apologize. No problem, Derek replied, forcing a smile. Just admiring your posture. Did someone teach you that on YouTube? The joke fell flat. No one laughed. The tension in the room had become almost palpable. Actually, James said calmly, I learned it at a place called the Las Vegas National Gym. Maybe you've heard of it. Derek frowned. The name sounded familiar, but he couldn't place the reference. Las Vegas? What kind of weekend boot camp did you do there? Sarah Chen discreetly pulled her phone out of her pocket and quickly typed, Las Vegas National Gym Martial Arts. What she found made her blood run cold. This wasn't just any prep course, it was where the world's greatest MMA champions of the last 3 decades had trained. Derek, James continued, his voice still calm, last chance. Apologize to Sarah for questioning her right to speak. Apologize to your students for turning this place into a circus. And most of all, apologize to yourself for becoming exactly the kind of person that martial arts should teach you not to be. The offer of clemency hung in the air like smoke. Derek could have chosen humility. He could have acknowledged that he had crossed a line. He could have preserved what little dignity he had left. Instead, he attacked. Derek's first punch was technically perfect, a fast, accurate jab, executed exactly as he had learned in the manuals. It was the kind of punch that worked against 99% of the people he had sparred with over the years. James wasn't in the 99%. The movement was so fast, so fluid, that half of those present couldn't even process what had happened. James simply wasn't where Derek's fist had been aimed. His body had slid to the side like water flowing around a rock, and suddenly Derek was off balance, his arm extended into thin air. Nice try, James commented softly, already repositioned and perfectly balanced. Clean technique. Adequate speed. But you telegraphed the move with your right shoulder. Derek spun wildly, trying to locate his opponent. How had someone moved so fast? Beginner's luck, he muttered, more to himself than to James. The second attack came in quick succession, jab, straight, hook. 3 punches linked together with the precision of someone who had practiced the combination thousands of times. It was his favorite sequence, the one he used to finish sparring sessions and impress beginners. Again, James simply wasn't there. This time, Sarah managed to follow the movement. James had lowered himself slightly, allowing the jab to pass over his head by inches. The straight punch found only air when he leaned back in an impossible curve. And when Derek threw the hook with all his strength, James took a small step back, causing the fist to pass millimeters from his chin. Interesting combination, James observed, still breathing evenly. Works well against people who stand still. But you're leaving your left side completely exposed after the hook. Derek was starting to sweat. This wasn't normal. He had landed thousands of punches in his life, and now he couldn't land a single one on a man who had supposedly never fought before. Stop dancing and fight. Derek shouted, launching an even more aggressive sequence. That's when James decided the demonstration had gone on long enough. Derek's third attack, a desperate combination of punches and kicks, found only air once again. But this time, something different happened. When Derek recovered after missing all his blows, James was inexplicably closer. How? Derek whispered, realizing he had completely lost control of the distance. Derek, James said softly, now an arm's length away, do you want to know the difference between someone who learned to fight in gyms and someone who learned in professional rings? Before Derek could answer, James did something that defied everything those present thought they knew about physics. Without appearing to use any force, without any sudden or aggressive movements, he simply touched Derek on the chest with the palm of his right hand. Derek flew. He wasn't pushed or knocked down. He was literally propelled backwards, as if struck by an invisible wave. His feet left the ground, he traveled nearly 2 meters through the air, and landed on his back with an impact that made everyone in the room gasp. The silence that followed was absolute. Derek lay on the floor for a few seconds, staring at the ceiling, trying to process what had happened. There was no pain, just the irresistible force of someone operating on a level completely different from anything he had ever known. That, Derek muttered, trying to get up, that's impossible. Sarah Chun had stopped breathing. In 2 years of studying martial arts, she had never witnessed such a controlled and devastating display of power. There was no brutality, no anger, just the clinical application of a technique she had only seen in legends. Actually, James said calmly, reaching out to help Derek to his feet, it's quite simple once you understand leverage, timing, and energy transfer. Principles I've learned over a 22-year professional career. Derek ignored the outstretched hand and stood up on his own, his legs still shaking. 22 years? Professional career in what? Sarah answered, her voice almost a whisper. You don't understand who he is, do you? Everyone turned to her, who was still holding her cell phone with the results of her search. On the screen, dozens of articles, photos, and videos confirmed what her instincts had already realized. James Washington, she read aloud, also known as Silent Storm. 5-time world mixed martial arts champion. Considered one of the best technical fighters in history. Retired undefeated after a 22-year career, following an accident that resulted in the death of his training partner. The impact of the words hit the room like a bomb. Derek felt his face go pale as reality set in. He had challenged a living martial arts legend. He had publicly humiliated someone who could have knocked him out with a casual move. 5-time world champion? Derek stammered, all his arrogance evaporating instantly. James nodded silently. I retired at 29. Since then, I've been working whatever jobs I can find. Cleaning, maintenance. Simple jobs, simple life. No spotlight, no cameras, no need to prove anything to anyone. The transformation in Derek was instantaneous and painful to watch. The arrogant man was gone, replaced by someone who finally understood the magnitude of his ignorance. I didn't know, Derek whispered. If I had known. If you had known, would you have treated me with respect? James interrupted gently. But would you still have humiliated some other janitor? Another worker who had no credentials to defend himself? The question cut deeper than any physical blow. Derek realized that James had put his finger on the root of his real problem, not ignorance about his credentials, but the fundamental arrogance that made him believe he could humiliate people based on their professions. Sarah stepped forward, her voice firm. Sensei Derek, for 2 years I have trained at this academy out of respect for your experience. But what I witnessed today was not teaching, it was bullying disguised as instruction. Other students began to murmur in agreement. The revelation about James had completely changed everyone's perspective on what they had witnessed. James, Derek said finally, his voice laden with a humility no one there had ever heard before, I sincerely apologize. To you, to Sarah, To everyone here. I have no excuse for my behavior. James nodded, accepting the apology with the same grace with which he had mastered the physical confrontation. Appreciated, Derek. But apologies are only the first step. The question is, what are you going to do differently from now on? Derek looked around the room, seeing his students with new eyes. Some seemed disappointed in his behavior, others clearly re-evaluating everything they thought they knew about respect and hierarchy. I'll change, Derek promised. It'll take time, but I'll change. That's when Sarah asked a question that surprised everyone. Mr. Washington, would you consider teaching again? Because I think we could all learn a lot more from someone who understands that true strength comes with responsibility. James smiled, the first genuine smile anyone had seen from him that night. Maybe. But not to teach fighting techniques. To teach something much more important, that respect isn't earned with belts or titles, but with character. As Derek fully absorbed the most humiliating lesson of his life, one question hung in the air: would one night of humility be enough to transform decades of arrogance, or would an even deeper change be necessary for true justice to be served? 3 months later, the gym had been completely transformed. James Washington was no longer just the janitor. Sarah Chun had convinced the gym owner to hire him as an instructor specializing in advanced techniques and martial arts philosophy. Derek Mitchell lost half of his students in the first week after the incident. The video Sarah had discreetly recorded spread across social media, showing a black belt being humiliated by a mere janitor. His reputation in the martial arts community was ruined. Sensei James, Sarah said after a class on respect and humility, thank you for teaching me that true strength doesn't need to be displayed to be recognized. James smiled, organizing the equipment. The best lesson I can teach is simple: never judge someone by their profession or appearance. Everyone carries stories that can surprise us. Derek continued teaching at a smaller gym, but now with a humility forced by public shame. He had learned the hard way that arrogance comes at a price. Sometimes justice comes quietly, like a storm that transforms everything without making a sound. James proved that true revenge is not destroying your opponent, but showing that greatness comes from character, not titles. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel to discover more stories about how extraordinary people turn humiliation into triumph.